were those faces in the crowd? Well, first, there were the disciples. Just a few days earlier, they had told Jesus that if he was going to go to Jerusalem to die, then they were going to go with him and they would die too. But as Jesus looked at them singing and celebrating and laughing and shouting praises to God on the road, he realized just how clueless they were. He had tried to divert their thinking of a triumphant God who would come and with his domineering force would come and fix everything. He tried to speak of God not in terms of power and glory, but in terms of mercy and justice and love. But they didn't get it. They didn't want to get it. Jesus had told him he was going to Jerusalem to die, but as they walked beside him that day, did they remember? So Jesus wept for his disciples. And perhaps he said to himself, enjoy this moment, my precious dear friends. Hold on to this moment. It will comfort you greatly in the days to come. What other faces did he see? Well, there were the ruthless Pharisees. Luke tells us that the Pharisees were also in the crowd, but we can be very sure that though they were in the midst of everything, they certainly were not celebrating. It must have fueled their intense anger to see all of the cheering for Jesus. For the one who threatened their power and their position. For the one they feared and hated. For the one whose head they had put a price on. Finally, when the Pharisees could take it no longer, they said, tell your disciples to be quiet. Tell them to stop praising God. And Jesus says, don't think for a minute that you can stop these people from praising God. And even if you could, the rocks and the stones would shout out. The Pharisees were lost in their pride, their stubborn pride, and their refusal to acknowledge Jesus and his message. But Jesus found no joy in their rejection. He wept for these men who were so close to the Father's house, but so far from the Father. They worship with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Jesus wept for them. Also standing on the sidelines in another group were the indifferent Roman soldiers. During Passover, anticipating the huge crowds, they had brought in thousands of extra Roman troops to make sure that there were no disturbances, to make sure that they could keep the Jews under control. And we can be sure that when this crowd of thousands and thousands joined in their parade, it did indeed get their attention. But they quickly discovered that it was a harmless gathering and no real threat to their authority. If Jesus caused no trouble, they'd leave him alone. They were indifferent to what was going on in the streets that day. And Jesus wept for them. And lastly, there were the faces of the rootless followers. This group was probably the largest, the loudest, and the most exuberant. These faces belonged to wishful thinkers. Surely they were all for Jesus now. They were ready to make him king, but only because they believed that Jesus was going to do what they wanted him to do. Now that he was here and would issue in a physical messianic kingdom, overthrow the bonds of the Roman government, and set up a Jewish empire, they were okay with this man, Jesus. Right now, they believed that Jesus was following their plan, and they loved him for that. But Jesus knew this group of followers. He knew that their roots were shallow, and their devotion was only temporary. Jesus wept, for he knew that in just a few days he would see them again, and this time they would be shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify Jesus!" Yeah, there was quite a crowd on that first Palm Sunday in Jerusalem. What about the crowds today? Have they changed much in 2,000 years? You and I are part of that crowd. When Jesus looks at the faces of today's world, what does he see? Does he see the indifferent Romans whose faces say, "Just don't bother me, Jesus. You go on, have your parade, let other people praise you, worship you, serve you. I just want to live my life. I want to live it as peacefully as I can, doing my own thing." Jesus weeps for them. Does he see in our world faces like the Pharisees, who are hostile to him? Those who refuse to accept the truth about him. Those who refuse to totally submit to his word. They don't like what he tells them to do. They don't want to give up their power and their position, their way of life. Jesus weeps for them as well. Perhaps he sees in the faces rootless followers. As long as Jesus follows their plans and fulfills their dreams, fulfills their needs, they're okay with Jesus. As long as Jesus agrees to act kind of like a genie in a lamp and makes no demands, then they'll shout his praises. But when the road gets rough and rocky, when the Lord asks them to follow someplace where they don't want to go, they'll leave the parade. "You can't run my life, Jesus. You demand too much. I may join the parade from time to time, but don't expect me to always go along." Jesus weeps also for them because they reject who he really is and refuse to accept what he really gives. But you know what? I think there are other tears that Jesus cries. He cries a different set of tears for those faithful followers. He cries as he sees the hardships that they endure for him. He cries as he sees their faith tried and tested. He weeps with joy when he sees their devotion. He cries tears of pride and of love, and those tears say, "I am with you, child, even unto the ends of the earth." It's almost Easter, my friends. Almost Easter. Many of you have traveled this Lenten journey from its beginning on Ash Wednesday. I don't know about you, but sometimes I found the road crowded with folks like me searching and trying desperately to somehow become more holy, or at least more worthy, forgetting that it's God's grace It's God's grace that truly redeems us. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I lost my way along this journey. Shamefully found myself giving way to some old habits. And sometimes I even wondered, sometimes I even pleaded, isn't there an easier way to get to the empty tomb? A few of us have gone right from Christmas to Easter. But you know what? Jesus has grown up. And it's time to take down the tinsel. And it's time to take down the Christmas tree. It's time to leave the peaceful, serene manger scene. For it is indeed time to stand with a different crowd. Today we shout hosannas and wave palm branches. But what about later in the week? Though many will try, you can't get to the Easter alleluias if you don't go on the road to Golgotha. Either you believe or you don't. Either you will or you won't. When we each find ourselves in the courtyard, when we are asked by the crowd outside the walls of this church, we must answer the question, do you know him or not? Will you serve him or not? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy